I did say thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Gareth Bennett. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a UKIP member of the Welsh Assembly. The main thing I've been asked to talk about today is the reasons why we need to scrap the Welsh Assembly. And unfortunately, they've only given me 15 minutes. I mean, I could go on all day about this subject. Obviously, that would not necessarily be greatly interesting to UKIP members who are from England, which is where the majority of our members are from, who might be thinking, well, so what? What's it got to do with us? Well, it does have something to do with all of us, and I will hopefully go some way to explaining why in the next few minutes. It can be boiled down to three main themes. One, the Welsh Assembly is completely out of touch with ordinary people. Two, it is an almost total waste of public money. And three, it is a forum for pushing minority rights to the extent that the majority of people in Wales are ultimately being discriminated against by the Assembly. It also matters because the Welsh Assembly is sticking its nose into things that doesn't concern it, such as Brexit. Brexit is an interesting illustration of how out of touch the Welsh Assembly is with its own electorate. The UK, as we know, voted to leave the European Union in the referendum in 2016. Wales also voted to leave by a slightly larger majority than the UK as a whole. Despite that inconvenient fact, the left-wing politicians who dominate the Assembly have spent the past 3 years wasting their time talking about the horror of Brexit. The Welsh Government have sent delegations to Westminster endlessly to see the Prime Minister about Brexit. Rather than preparing for Brexit, the Welsh ministers have spent 3 years doing their utmost to prevent Brexit from happening, despite the fact that Wales voted to leave. This is only one example, though, of how out of touch the Cardiff Bay bubble, as we like to call it, really is. There are many other examples. Some of the legislation they have been driving through since 2016, which UKIP has been opposing, includes prisoner voting. Despite opinion polls consistently showing that a large majority of Welsh people oppose the idea of any prisoners having the vote. Then there is the smacking ban. Again, despite widespread opposition from the vast majority of the general public, the Welsh Labour government and their left-wing allies in Plaid Cymru are pushing through a bill which will probably criminalise several dozens of parents every year for the so-called offence of administering even something as minimal as a light smack on the hand or the bottom to a misbehaving toddler. It won't affect many people, but I'm sure there will be lives needlessly smashed up as a result of entirely needless prosecutions. And not a single extra child will be protected by this legislation, as the police and the CPS can already investigate and prosecute anyone they really suspect is doing harm to children under the existing laws. What this crazy new law will do is remove any discretion that the police currently have as to whether or not to carry out a criminal inquiry, even if they suspect that an allegation has been made maliciously. So the Assembly is out of touch. It's a kind of echo chamber where the parties of the left can agree with one another over this kind of virtue signalling nonsense and close down anyone with the temerity to disagree. They do like to silence the dissidents, as I found out to my cost. I have been banned from the Assembly twice. Now, I wasn't expecting them all to agree with me when I got into the Assembly, but I wasn't expecting them to be trying to close me down and ban me all the time. I did think there would be some kind of respect for democracy in the place. Unfortunately, I find that there is very little. Anyway, I've been talking about this for a couple of minutes. Perhaps it's time to have a quick look at some of the things that have been going on in the Assembly over the past 3 years.
Leader of the UKIP group, Gareth Bennett.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First Minister, which of the following decisions do you think that Natural Resources Wales can be proudest of? Is it the dumping of 300,000 tonnes of nuclear mud approximately 1 mile from Cardiff Bay? Or is it giving a licence for a biomass incinerator which neighbours residential properties in Barry Dock? Or finally, is it refusing to sell timber from public woodland at market value, potentially fleecing the Welsh taxpayer of £1 million? Now, you're talking about me wanting to remove scrutiny. I'm talking about wanting to remove this entire useless institution, the Welsh Assembly, of which you've been at the heart of for 18 years. The problem is not the scrutiny by backbenchers, because when they do scrutinise, you rubbish it anyway and you remove them from the committees. The point is that the government you've been part of for 18 years isn't fit to run these institutions, and that's why the Welsh public gets an awful deal from the Welsh Assembly. Is that not the case, First Minister?
There we go.
Sorry, I have asked nicely. Will you please, can we listen to the member?
Thank you.
So we will listen, please.
Thank you. There is also something more than a little dishonest about this argument over more members being needed. The 1997 referendum was a vote for an assembly, which was then set at 60 members. There was no talk of it having to expand later. The 2011 referendum called for primary lawmaking powers, but didn't explain that more members would be needed once this had been achieved. Curiously, though, as soon as the new powers arrived, politicians in Cardiff Bay started to tell us that there was now too much for everyone to do. Too much legislation, too much scrutiny. So it has been a bit of a circular argument, really. Give us more powers, the AMs screech. Westminster, after a bit of a battle, duly obliges. 5 minutes later, the AMs screech, give us more members. So the Assembly asks for more powers, gets them, then tells the public they don't have enough people to deal with the new powers they themselves called for. This is basically a political scam, to hoodwink the Welsh public into accepting more AMs by stealth. Well, you're not going to get your 30 more members, not unless we have a referendum on it first. That's my view, and that's the UKIP view, and that's why I'm moving today's UKIP motion. We are going to have a lot of fun with this over the next few years if we continue to proceed as a society with this kind of minority-obsessed nonsense. What we need to do is have a grown-up conversation about the issue of minority rights and accept that there have to be limits to them. There is only so much deviation from the norm that any society can take before that society completely implodes. And if we carry on down this road of appeasing the nuttiest elements of the transgender movement, then what we will face as a society within a very short space of time is total implosion.
Diolch i'r ysgrifennydd.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Point of order.
I'd like to, I want to raise a point of order regarding Gareth Bennett's disgraceful outpouring of homophobic rhetoric in this chamber yesterday, while talking about, ironically, the debate on Equality and Human Rights Commission annual report.
You were informed that this point of order was to be made, Gareth Bennett, and I would like to give you the opportunity to withdraw your comments from yesterday and to apologise to this chamber and to those who have taken offence.
Thank you. There will be no apology, there will be no withdrawal.
Thank you for that contribution, and you will know that I did not intervene yesterday, and I take the right of Assembly members in this chamber to make comments that aren't wholly appreciated by other members very seriously. But on careful reflection of those words uttered yesterday, I have no doubt in my own mind that they were particularly hateful to transgender people, in reference in particular to deviation from the norm. I have made my ruling on this. I have asked the member to apologise and to withdraw his comments. He has said that he will not do so. That member will not be called in this chamber in 2018 until he has done so.
We move on to the 90-second statements.
Okay, hopefully that film illustrated some of the points I've been making. You hopefully get a picture of the kind of place that the Welsh Assembly actually is. Now, can I make another point? Here we all are at the UKIP conference, which is in Newport, which is part of Wales. Most of you will have come here from other parts of the United Kingdom. You will have observed that you didn't need passports to cross the border, because there is no border. The air here is exactly the same. The grass looks the same. The only difference is that the road signs are bigger because everything has to be in 2 languages. This is so that the Welsh language lobby can be satisfied that a Polish lorry driver managed to see the Welsh translation of the sign saying Low Bridge seconds before he drove his lorry under it and got stuck. Yes, the obsession with the Welsh language can be viewed in a humorous light, but as we know, cluttered road signage will lead to more accidents, and everyone in Wales who speaks Welsh also speaks English. So one might ask why exactly we need to create more risk and waste more money on these bilingual signs. But that is because of the fixation of the Welsh Assembly with the Welsh language, despite the fact that Welsh is spoken and written by only around 15% of the population of Wales, and I did say 15, not 50. In the Assembly, even security guards now have to have the ability to speak some level of Welsh before they can be employed. This requirement to speak Welsh is now creeping into other public sector areas in Wales, such as councils and the health service. Effectively, it is the Welsh Assembly discriminating in favour of 15% of the population, and discriminating against 85% of the people of Wales. We now have an official Welsh Government policy of trying to create 1 million Welsh speakers in Wales by 2050. This may sound laudable, but it will actually mean more English language schools turning into bilingual schools, and even worse, bilingual schools becoming Welsh-only schools. This actually happened in Llangennech in West Wales, despite the majority of the villagers wanting to keep their school bilingual. But the Welsh Assembly allowed the local authority to turn it into a Welsh-only school in any case. Our education system, as UKIP members will be aware, is getting more and more dysfunctional in the UK as a whole. In Wales, we have our own extra layer of dysfunction, as more and more pupils are pushed towards speaking Welsh. Most people would think that speaking English as a first language is a natural advantage that British people have when going out into the wider world, where English is, of course, a major international language. But no, in Wales we have to forego this advantage in favour of an obsession with Welsh, a minority language spoken by very few people even within Wales itself, and by hardly anyone outside Wales at all. The fixation with Welsh has been one factor in Wales's diabolical performances in the international PISA education rankings, where we have plummeted in the 20 years since the Welsh Assembly was set up. The decline in education highlights how the Welsh Assembly simply doesn't work. There is no devolution dividend, as we were promised. In fact, things tend to work worse after devolution than they did beforehand. Take the National Health Service. A lot of people in Wales live near England, and in some cases their local hospital is in England. I would say over the border, but there is no border, of course. This is part of the issue. We had a recent case where the Countess Hospital in Chester, in England, was refusing to accept patients from Wales, even though it was their local hospital, because they weren't being properly reimbursed for treatment by the Welsh Government. This kind of dispute would simply never have arisen before we had devolution in Wales. This also demonstrates that the Assembly is ultimately a waste of money. Wales would be far more effectively governed through the institutions of Westminster and Whitehall. Welsh MPs could scrutinise the government through the Welsh Affairs Select Committee and by reinstituting the Welsh Grand Committee. Despite the existence of the Assembly with its 60 members, there are still 40 Welsh MPs. What on earth is there for them to do? Very little, as much of the Welsh policy-making power has been diverted from Westminster to Cardiff Bay. The waste of money is one thing, but there is a more sinister side to the Welsh Assembly, which also applies to the other devolved legislatures, the Scottish Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly. I haven't said much about them today because we have Donald Mackay and Alan Love talking about them here in this hall tomorrow. Now, the more sinister aspect of devolution relates to the issue of sovereignty. UKIP has spent 25 years arguing for the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom Parliament, which UKIP has argued, correctly, was being eroded from without by the European Union in Brussels, which was why we campaigned successfully for a referendum on Brexit, which was why we were able to win the referendum on Brexit, which is why we've been campaigning for the past 3 years for the UK government to deliver us Brexit. But all the while, sovereignty was also being drained from the UK Parliament at Westminster, from within the UK, from the devolved assemblies and the devolved governments. Which is why we now have the Welsh so-called government and the Scottish so-called government making deputations to Westminster to try and stop Brexit. But Brexit has nothing to do with them because foreign policy and trade policy are not devolved issues. They're effectively sticking their noses into something that shouldn't concern them. You see, conference, where we are headed if we carry on along this course is towards a federal United Kingdom, where the so-called Prime Ministers of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland sit around a table with the Prime Minister of the UK as if they are all equals. As if the UK Prime Minister has first to consult them before he can sign any international trade deal, before he can embark on any particular defence policy. It's as if Boris Johnson has to ask Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford before he can go to the toilet. This cannot be allowed to go on, or surely we are heading for the end of the United Kingdom as a unified sovereign state. And UKIP is a unionist party. Perhaps we are now the only true unionist party. So how do we stop this endless march towards federalism? Well, my solution is a referendum on Thursday, the 2nd of May, 2024, on the 25th anniversary of devolution. Why do we need a referendum, and are there dangers implicit in this? Is it not the case that we have already had 2 referendums on the Welsh Assembly? Well, yes and no. It is true that we've had 2 referendums related to the Welsh Assembly, but I believe they are of limited validity. The first referendum took place in 1997 and asked the Welsh public if they wanted an assembly. The public said yes. It was by a very slim majority, but that is of no consequence. It was a legitimate mandate for the then Blair government to set up a Welsh Assembly. As we know, if you devolve a decision to the public and you have a referendum and the referendum says one thing, it is necessary for the government to then act to implement that referendum and to implement the will of the people. So I have no issue whatsoever with the Assembly having been set up in the first place. That's not the case I'm making. It would have been entirely wrong, once the referendum had been granted, to ignore the majority who voted and not to set up the Welsh Assembly. The narrowness of the majority is not in any way part of my case. The second referendum took place in 2011, but it is largely irrelevant to what I'm saying, since it only asked the public if they wanted the same powers for the Assembly or if they wanted greater powers. There was no option for people who did not want the Assembly at all. As a result, there was no great reason for a lot of people to vote. Hence, this second referendum was a total damp squib with a turnout of only 36%. As I say, this second referendum was an almost total irrelevance. The second referendum offered no option to get rid of the Assembly. The first referendum was 22 years ago and took place before the Assembly came into being. We have now had 20 years of the Assembly, and people have had enough time to make a reasoned decision as to whether or not it has improved the governance of Wales. In May 2024, we will have had 25 years of devolved government. I think that is a good time to hold a meaningful referendum on whether or not we want to continue with the experiment of having devolved government in Wales. UKIP, of course, will abide by the result. But the political establishment in Wales, if they think that their precious assembly is so good, should not be scared to put it to a democratic test after 25 years of operation. In closing, I thank you all for listening. I'm now coming to the end of this speech, which of course was very important, but it's going to be overtaken by something rather more momentous because I think we're about to have the refreshment break. But Kirsten will tell you about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.